Welcome to On the Line. I'm Christine Williams. Coming up for discussion on our Viewpoints panel. Is it time to implement measures to cap the salary of top-earning CEOs? Later on, we'll be talking about pet care. Stay tuned. And these are the issues we'll be presenting today to our Viewpoints guests for commentary. Given the prosperity gap in our country, is it time to look at ways to cap the salaries of top-earning CEOs said to be earning more in a day than the average Canadian earns in a year? Britain has refused to apologize for the slave trade, and an anti-slavery protester confronted the Queen in what has been described as a PR nightmare. And politics in Quebec following the election. What does a surprising turn mean for Quebec and the rest of Canada? Later on, we'll be talking about pet care with a visiting vet. But first, let's meet our Viewpoints guests. Barrie Doyle is a PR consultant with Gateway Communications, and Robert Metz is president of the Freedom Party. Thank you both so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Now, the first issue. It's not an isolated cause here. We've been seeing it from time to time, and the headline is MP targets CEO salaries. Now, this MP is New Democrat Chris Charlton. She proposes that, in fact, she introduced a private member's bill making it harder for companies to be paying their chief executives what is said here, stratospheric salaries. She's implemented some measures here talking about, well, when it comes to certain tax claims or whatever, that's how she's going to do it. But the bottom line is, do we need to introduce such measures in the country in order to control these exorbitant salaries being earned by the CEOs? Going to start with you, Barrie.
First of all, to me, it's the pot calling the kettle black, because the first one that would object to any kind of controls on his or her salaries is a politician who are not getting paid enough for all the wonderful work that they do. I mean, that's the story that they got. I think that the controls will come from within the industries, from within business. I don't think politicians need to be involved in this. If companies are paying exorbitant salaries, the public outcry will be such, and you're already seeing it with the Loblaws situation, that there's going to be some toning down. Business knows and understands the public doesn't like it. They'll stop it.
Do you have a problem with that gap that we see in this country? Because that's her premise.
Sure, there's a gap, you know. I mean, but
gap is
that's
natural.
not the way to deal with it?
That's not the way to do it. There's too much of this government.
Too much government involvement. Yeah. You're concerned about
Listen,
that,
if
Robert.
he goes to work and I sit at home and do nothing, guess what? There's going to be a gap in our income. You know
Be careful, Robert. Be careful, Robert, because there are people out there, they're making minimum wage.
Well,
there's the...
I'm one of them, okay? I'm not making a big fortune, and the minimum wage, you know, it's not... I'm not surprised that an NDP would want to see a minimum and a maximum wage, because they want to control everything, okay? But that's not what it's all about. And it's funny, because when I read the justification here, out of one side of the mouth it says we want to bar companies from claiming corporate tax deduction, right?
Yes, yes.
But then they say, well, you know, we really... Then out of the next side of the mouth, where salaries are completely out of proportion with what the rest of the country takes home. Well, what are you complaining about, the salary or the taxes?
Yeah.
And why are you hiding the two in a single issue? Because, of course, they want more taxes for government. I'd like to know what we're doing about the CEOs who got out on Ontario Hydro, and we're still paying that debt charge on our...
Or the Ontario Lottery and Gaming Commission.
That's a good point.
Exactly. The corruption within the government's own enterprises is unbelievable, and the salaries that they pay for inefficient and backward service is unbelievable. So leave the private sector alone. They're doing everything. Every penny the government spends, they steal from the private sector. So for heaven's sakes, let's quit this nonsense.
The other thing is, too, is I mentioned Loblaws, and there were articles in the paper a little earlier this week which talked about the severance that they'd given a former president. But the new president and some of his new colleagues, they will get no, if they're fired, there's no severance. Their salaries are considerably less than what they were paying this one fellow. So I think they're learning that this is not acceptable, and they're going to adjust themselves. You know, if
I think I would have benefited having an NDPer put his point of view in here today. So, listen to what Naresh Agarwal of McMaster University Business School says. He says that it isn't an issue what CEOs are making. This is what he says. That's not the main issue. He says the issue only draws public anger when huge salaries are paid to leaders of companies like Enron. Yes. But I beg to differ on this note. I'm not saying I agree or disagree at this point, but I have seen other headlines talk about what CEOs are making, top earning. Now, it's worthwhile to remember that in this particular article, Chris Charlton is targeting people that make more than $1 million. That is the incentive there. If you're making more than that, there's no corporate deduction for you there. But I've heard this issue come out. So for somebody from the business school to come and deny this, it is an issue in society. Once again, I'm not saying I agree with it, but there are those, and it is a moral issue that say, should you have a CEO making so much money? In fact, more than one article said, by the time you have your morning coffee, that CEO has earned basically as much as the average person earns in a year. So should there be a ceiling somehow?
But why are we picking on the...
Why is a good question, but this is an argument. It's always been an argument when you look at the left and the right.
Why are we picking... Let's look at sports personalities. Let's look
at
movie celebrities.
I mentioned that on one of our programs.
Let's not look at any of them, and they've all earned their money, otherwise they wouldn't be getting what they're getting.
I think the issue is some of them haven't earned their money.
Are you a true blue capitalist here?
Well, it's not about... You know, people think that what you earn in life is based on how hard you work, and that's not true.
You see, very interesting point.
What you earn in life depends on what you produce versus what you spend, and what the demand for what you produce is. If you can work as hard as you want, and if nobody buys a single thing of what you produce, you're going to still be poor, and you've put in all that work, and it's just not going to pay off for you. And then another guy invents a pet rock, puts a little head on it, and makes millions of dollars. Okay, I don't know if you remember that.
I do remember the pet rocks.
Or an athlete that works for that does nothing and is pulling down $6 million a year or whatever.
So it's not even about necessities or essential services or anything like that. It's just about you have to leave the market free. If you don't leave the market free, then, and by free we mean free pricing. Letting people decide what the relationship is between them in terms of what they think their comparative worth is worth, and leave it at that. Nobody else can decide what your minimum wage is or your maximum wage except you, and that's
what
the
you
way
said
it
is a
stay.
fact of our capitalist economy.
Right.
It's a fact, and it can be argued, but that is where the argument lies. Some people believe it's not fair. It's not fair that you have such a gap between the rich and the poor, and no, it's not. No, it's not. You can't argue fair from the point of view of, well, it's argued based on, okay, take the garbage collector, for instance. Okay, try having a society that, and I cannot believe I'm arguing here on this side, because the point of the matter is, I've been described as right-wing, okay, but I'm going to play what they call devil's advocate here. And I understand the argument from a moral ground. You've got the person. I would not want to live in a society without garbage collectors, for instance, or people that sweep. I will not want to live in a society like this. Can you only imagine? Now, the top earning CEO will not be free to enjoy his earnings if there was garbage strewn all over the place. So you see, that is the basis of the argument. I understand the fairness of it, but that's not our system.
That a job like that has to give someone earning of a living.
Worth. It's the worth, what you're doing. For what it's worth.
What you do, what determines what that's worth, depends on how many other people do what you do, and how many people want it.
Yes,
so if there's 50 of you that do this, and only one of me that wants that,
supply
49 of you are out of a job.
Yes, competition, supply and demand.
The thing that bothers me about, and coming from an NDPer, in one sense, they're playing to the crowd on this one. I want to see some action on poverty, some real action on poverty.
I do too.
That's where it needs to be.
That's what I would like to see too.
Don't worry about what somebody's earning. Like, let's deal with the root elements of poverty at home and poverty overseas. That's where the justice and compassion comes in, not in deciding what someone else makes.
I'm living in poverty because I'm making minimum wage. But there you go, because the minimum wage is one. where it's being called for ever so often, every few years we see a call for a higher minimum wage because, as you said, there are those living in poverty. They're working hard. They're working full-time hours, sometimes over that.
Yeah, but
And
raising
they're
the
still
minimum
making
wage just increases the number of people in
I've
poverty.
argued that. I've argued that. But okay, let's hear your point of view. I want to see if it's the same argument I've
Even this
had.
liberal
like this.
government, even this liberal government that just introduced
Even
this, their own studies came out and said if we did it right away, we'd lose $100,000 to $180,000 or 180,000 jobs. And so it says, well, so we're going to phase it in over 3 years. Well, you're still going to lose
You do
those
lose jobs. You
but
can't argue
only
that. That's
over
true.
3 years.
You've got a good argument. That cannot be argued against.
Yeah,
Plus, when you raise that, it ends up being relative. So the cost of living naturally over time drives up.
So
It's
Ontario
no easy solution.
just got legislation that increased unemployment by 100-some-odd thousand people, and we're all going, yay, yay.
Well, it's a
because
pity we
10
cannot
people got a
solve
raise.
that problem of poverty in this segment. Maybe we'll solve it the next one.
I think poverty is the issue,
Now-
not salaries. Right.
Now, Britain had a PR nightmare on their hands while they were actually going through their ceremonies commemorating the 200 years of the abolition of slavery. A protester stepped in. We'll be talking about it after this. Stay tuned. Hello again and welcome back to Viewpoints on the Line. Take a look at this next headline. This is a disgrace. Now, here's how the headline opens, the story from London. Steps from the Queen, spitting distance from the Prime Minister, his voice ricocheting off hundreds of statues and monuments. Now, this is a protester that just walked onto the floor, as you saw by that picture, halted Britain's national service, marking 200 years since the end of the slave trade. Now, this is further to something else that had happened because basically Prime Minister Tony Blair had outright refused to make an apology for Britain's involvement in the slave trade. Now, I'm going to tie this with something very interesting because I did an interview not long ago with one of the 4 producers of Amazing Grace, where Wilberforce was the hero that was responsible for the abolition of the slave trade and so forth. And of course, it sort of renews a sort of a fury, if you want to put it that way, or even an understanding on some ends in society. So perhaps that could have been part of it as well. This movie was released everywhere. Now, this was embarrassing. They're calling it a public relations disaster because this guy came out, and according to what this very smart writer writes here, which white man, quote, wanted to be photographed hauling a black man out of church in handcuffs on the day the nation came to seek forgiveness for a practice the Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, had just called this atrocity and universal sinfulness. That is a public relations nightmare, and there are 2 aspects to this. Perhaps your feelings about the reaction of the protester, maybe what the options would have been that could have been done, as well as Tony Blair, should he or should he not have apologized? And I'm going to start with you this time. What's your analysis of the article, and what do you see about this?
Well, first of all, I think too many people today are accepting this unearned guilt for something that their ancestors of their ancestors of their ancestors did way back when. And until we let go of that, we'll have perpetual wars, perpetual racism, perpetual conflicts. And so let's give it up already. You're talking about a lone protester who obviously I have some sympathy for. Maybe he has some problems or something. He's carrying some baggage here.
Of course he is.
Because this is not about slavery per se, but he's trying to turn it into a racial issue. And if you actually look at slavery, and I took a quick look in my my encyclopedia. Okay, yeah, Britain's the first country to end slavery, so we're going to make them apologize? That's ridiculous. United States, a year afterwards, in 1808. And after that, even after they ended slave trade in England, many Brits went to Portugal and flew under the Spanish and continued the slave trade there. United States ended it in 1808. The French, not till 1848. The Dutch, not till 1863. And in Brazil, not till 1888. And not in all these cases was it an issue of race. And
you do know why, though, because Hollywood of recent times have really sort of put, Britain and even America front and center, if you remember that old movie Roots. I mean, everybody was watching that. Yes, exactly.
And if you go back into early African history, you'll find slavery existed there.
Of course, right there.
Black between black.
Exactly.
The Greeks had slaves, the Romans had slaves.
And if you look at the Jewish history with the Egyptians, yes.
And if you really want to talk about it, we can all consider ourselves slaves to some degree when we're paying over 50% of our net income to the government. Because literally, if instead of them doing that to you, if they forced you into a labor camp and told you for the next 6 months, you're going to do what we want you to do, isn't that slavery? And how is it different if they let you go home every night? You know, you ever see that old Star Trek?
I still don't want to minimize slavery. And on the note of what that movie Amazing Grace was trying to accomplish as well, is that slavery to this day is still happening.
And that's
sex slaves, as well as slaves, as according to what this article describes in many countries.
So why pick on the country that ended it first? Why pick on the people who find it most offensive and force them to apologize for something that other people in the world are still doing? I
think there's a couple of things here. First of all, to pick up a little bit of what Robert's saying, I think we have a culture of offenses in society today. I'm offended. It doesn't matter what you do.
Walking on eggshells. Everybody walks on eggshells now.
And you've always got to apologize because I'm offended. And I mean, let's leave that alone for a second here. In terms of a public relations nightmare, I mean, one. As far as I'm concerned, the authorities did the right thing. This is a church service, and the laws are very clear in Canada, the United States, Britain. Just to interrupt and disrupt a church, a service of worship is an offense. That's number one. Number two, the reason he did it, of course, was because the Prime Minister and the Queen were there, and in this culture, forget the racism, forget the slavery, in this terrorism culture, the security people stepped in. The Queen is there. He could have had anything on him, a bomb, it could mean anything. So it's not a racist thing. It's not a PR disaster. They did it, actually they did it quite gently. They did it quite respectfully. And I think the whole thing, to call it a PR disaster, I'm sorry, it wasn't a PR disaster. I think the PR disaster was that particular individual who chose a moment, and that seems to be another thing in society today, this guerrilla type of thing where I'm going to hijack your event to make a point. And that's what happened here. That's the PR disaster.
I want to focus for a little while here on this
point.
whole apology issue.
Yeah.
Now, Japan recently apologized for the sex slaves in history, and every now and then in the papers you see it. One group comes and asks for an apology from another group, and it seems to be the buzzword, apologize. My concern is, I can tell you what you want to hear. I can say sorry, but who says I really am? I don't know
Especially
if apology
when you
cuts
didn't
it.
do it.
No, but I find that, no, but that seems to be, and
Well, I'm
it
sorry you
seems to
feel
have
that
been,
way.
No, but seriously, it seems to always be an issue. Even sometimes when politicians say something offensive or make a faux pas, the media comes out, well, they didn't apologize. And if they apologize, it seems to make everything okay. Apology in itself. I mean, if you really want an apology from me, if it makes you really feel better, I'll do it. And I'm speaking from Christine's point of view here. If it really helps you psychologically and you need an apology from me, I will give you one. Even if it's something my forefathers did, because it's not no skin off my back. I didn't do it. But it's no skin off my back if it makes you feel better.
But you've got to listen to the words of the apology.
But haven't you
is the apology for the offense, or is the apology because you're offended?
Well, I cannot apologize for something somebody else did because I did not do it. But if it helps you with your psychological recovery, maybe it's a good point. I mean, that's just something I'm bringing up here.
I don't think we should be bending over to help ill and sick people in that way, because I think then we just spread the disease into society. I really don't think that people should be apologizing for things that they didn't do. To me, doesn't this smack of racism right through and through, to hold someone because of their culture or color today, 300 years later, so they compare the color of that person to the color of the people doing this 300 years ago, and then therefore transfer the guilt. Now, isn't that exactly what racism is and what we're supposed to be wiping out?
No matter what
that
you
very
do.
thinking?
Yes.
Right, but that's politically correct thinking. That's what that is. You know, the sad thing about this whole thing is that the very point of the service and all the celebrations and the commemorations were to recognize what Wilberforce and his
that
group
is a key
and
issue
they have all
here,
been. That's
because
all been
Wilberforce
forgotten.
was a hero. I mean, he
it's
stood
totally
up
forgotten.
against some sinister forces at the time. Nobody is making excuses for the history, but we could say that Wilberforce was a true hero who stood up in the face of, my goodness, tons of opposition.
Absolutely. And this guy
this is
undermined
us,
it.
and that should be applauded. As for Tony Blair, if he doesn't want to apologize because he doesn't see the point, he should come out and say so. But to say that he's going to be liable for lawsuits as a result of an apology, I've yet to see that happen. I don't know if I stand along with him.
Problems.
Maybe that's what it is.
Well, yeah.
Maybe that's what it is.
There you go.
But I just sympathize because I like Tony.
You know, there is some truth to that, though. You know, if once you accept a responsibility for something and say, I did it or I'm sorry, you better watch out.
It makes sense, but it hasn't happened because I could apologize for something somebody else did. But to take me to court, it doesn't make any sense.
You've got Harper paying apologizing and paying compensations for the head tax, the Chinese head tax. You've got all
never ending. You know, you apologize, but dishing out money, it's a different story. And some people might say, well, it goes along, but
that's what the two are hand in hand. If you apologize, if you're really sorry, you've got to relieve my feelings, and the best way to do that is with money. And so you've got to pay compensation in order to take care of it.
Yeah. And the other question is, to whom are we apologizing? Or to whom would they... Because that person was not a victim of anything. That lone protester was never a slave, has never existed in such a time, probably doesn't even know what it was like other than what he's seen in the same movies or whatever. But I mean, it's not even part of his experience. So why does he deserve any kind of apology?
I'm going to put a positive twist on this. If you look at hundreds of years later, there are many people in this country, in Britain, in North America, all over the world, that through a series of horrible circumstances 200 years ago, their family, their ancestors are now here, and many have done well for themselves, have gotten educated, they're doing fantastic. And that needs to be applauded as well, because this is a free society.
But if we're going to talk about slavery, let's talk about slavery and say, okay, if you're that concerned about it, don't worry about, and don't make the big fuss about apologizing for something that happened 200 years ago. Do something about slavery now in Darfur, in Sudan, in those places.
Producers of Amazing Grace are trying to accomplish.
That's what, if you really want to do something, if this protester really wanted to do something, then I think he should be focusing the attention on those issues, because that's slavery that's existing right now in society, some 27 million people in slavery right now. Do something about that. Don't worry about getting an apology for something that happened way back when.
That needs to be the focus. We're going to go for a break now. When we come back, we'll be talking about Quebec and the fallout from the election. Stay tuned. Hello again and welcome back to Viewpoints on the Line. This next article, we're talking about what is occurring now in Quebec now that the elections are over. Now here you have a headline there referring to the monetary issues there, which are fundamental. Minority puts tax cut in jeopardy. Now this article is actually referring to Charest, who actually vowed to defend his $700 million budget centerpiece. He intends to go through with that. But the central theme of this article is not only that, it's the Quebec elections, a surprise win that we saw with the ADQ, that basically for the rest of Canada, I'm not sure if you interview Quebecers on that, whether they might have been as surprised as the rest of Canada, but
I think they
in a way it was. In a way it was very
have.
surprising, at least you think it would be.
Yeah, I think it
yes.
would be. I think what happened there was we don't like Charest. And I like Jean Charest. I've met him, and he's a nice guy. I like him.
We're tired of the separatists.
We don't like what he's been doing. He hasn't been doing enough. We don't want to do the separatist thing, so we.
Am I hearing protest vote here?
Yes.
Loud and clear.
I think that's what it was. I think that's what it was.
In a sense, all voting is protest because people generally vote against things, not so much for things. I can still see that surprised look on Bob Ray's face the night he got elected and got a majority government. He was looking like somebody just prodded him with a cattle prod, like he was in shock, you know? And so again, that was because of the dissatisfaction people had with the other options.
Now, it's very interesting what you said about people normally vote against things. You see that when there's a shift in a long-term preference. Because if you look at the trend with the Liberal government all these years, people were voting for the Liberals all these years until it got to the point where we see a new minority government. So that's been brought up as a suggestion for a protest vote. But it's not always that way. You get governments that people are comfortable with and they continue to vote for them. But when you see a sudden shift, that's when you could usually attribute it to a protest vote, wouldn't you say?
Well, it certainly seems to have upset the status quo, and I mean the bloc has been around for a while. Sometimes
Certainly.
when it came into the scene, it stayed
Certainly.
there. You know, even at the level it was there. So I guess if there's a lesson to be learned, you can't count on the status quo staying the same way as it always has.
People
it
get
seems
older.
like that.
People get older.
And I think loyalties are changing in terms of the traditional parties as well.
Demographics has a lot to do with it too.
I think the biggest, not surprise, but the biggest thing to look for now is not the three parties in Quebec, but the bloc in Ottawa. How is this going to play out with the bloc? Will Gilles Duceppe leave the bloc and go, take over? Because they say Boisclair is basically done now.
It seems like he's done. That's what they're suggesting.
So will Gilles Duceppe go over and lead them? If that happens, what happens to the bloc? And how does that play out for Harper? And how does this whole thing play out for Harper in Quebec?
Well, he gave a pretty big piece of the pie to Quebec.
That's right.
And let's not forget an ultimatum that was made way back when, that if you don't give this much X amount in transfers, some $3 billion, we're not going to support you. And lo and behold, it was given. It was granted.
No, it's interesting times in Quebec. It was the first minority government in something like 100 years.
That's right, 125 years
and a very
to be precise.
A very tight minority. It's not a comfortable minority. Harper's got a comfortable minority, so he can say things like, "Well, we don't care. We're going to go ahead and do it." I hear what Charest is saying. We're going to stick to that budget, but I'm thinking, what are you leading? 45 to 42.
Here. The man's trying to survive.
I don't think, one or two votes the wrong way, and he's out. Remember Joe Clark? Boy, it's tough. I think it's going to be tough for Charest to stick to that.
Well, you keep hearing the big question: what does it take to make a minority government work? That is the big question. Lots of collaboration. It takes a majority. That's the preference. But what if you are? You're a tight minority.
The people who like minority governments generally spend more than majority governments because everybody's giving it into everybody.
Definitely.
And so the country generally slips into more debt. But what I found interesting is that the Globe and Mail story tried to make the spin of this, that it was a $700 million income tax cut that helped, that caused Jean Charest to lose his majority in Monday's election. And I don't really think that had anything directly to do with it. I think there were too many other issues involved, and that people weren't voting against a $700 million income tax cut.
Well, other articles that were written, and this is something that I'm sure could be argued because most political assertions can, but from other writings that I've seen, that Charest, it's not it was a series of what was quoted as broken promises in that province that has really sunk financially. It's become a poorer province. Economically, it's doing bad. They've seen record low employment, and unfortunately, the person that's in power is usually the one blamed. So you're not looking at just this one thing. He's just vowing because, I mean, the number looks good.
I want to pick up on something that Robert said there about Bob Rae. I didn't really see it with Mario Dumont, but I rather suspect that the ADQ were sitting there thinking, wow, I was almost the premier. I mean, I think they're in shock, and people are saying, "Well, what are they going to do, and how are they going to fit, and are they going to support this?" And I don't think they know. I think they're sitting there thinking, "My goodness,
what am I going to do?
What are we going to do?"
Don't they have a platform?
Their platform was vote against him and vote against them. That was their platform.
They've been described as to the right of the Liberals, and not quite separatists.
Yeah. Right. No, I honestly, I think a lot of their if you go back through their the campaign, a lot of the ADQ was very much don't vote for them because you don't want to go separatist, so don't vote for the Parti Québécois.
They played it well.
Well, sure they did, and it was very, very well done. But in terms of what are we going to do, what are we for?
What do we do now?
That's
it remains to be seen.
Right.
That's the question.
It's interesting that Dumont himself says, he's warning the rest of Canada that it would be a mistake to perceive him as an unequivocal defender of federalism.
Yes.
So that means we could be seeing more trouble on that front, but coming from a different party.
And the unknown can be pretty scary, can't it?
Well, sometimes, I don't know. The known is scary enough to me lately.
The known is scary? Well, I guess we differ.
Anything will do, yeah.
I remember when the Parti Québécois first won it was René Lévesque when he first won in Quebec, and I was talking to a Quebecer. I called him the next morning, and I said, because I knew he was a very staunch Liberal, and I said, so what do you think? He said, well, the sun still went up this morning.
Well, there you go.
So,
Almost a positive twist.
a positive twist.
You know what happened on that day since then? If you check the records, I was in the banking industry at the time. Up until the election of René Lévesque, the Canadian dollar was always higher than the American. After that, never again.
Okay.
But do you notice on the point of the dollar, the Canadian dollar, it went up almost immediately after this election.
After this one, yeah.
Yes. Thought I'd just roll that one in. We're out of time. Yes, go ahead.
Was he a banker? He was a banker. Was he earning those exorbitant fees?
Yeah.
that
Maybe that's why he's
Salaries are
defending.
talking about? Yeah, that's what it is.
That's what
Our
mortgage
capitalist
clerks and
society.
accountants make, yeah.
Right. We'll find out after. Thank you both so much for joining me today. We're going to go for a break now. When we come back, a visit with the vet. We'll be talking about pet care. Stay tuned.
Ground transportation provided by JP Motor Sales, located at 2320 Fairview Street in Burlington.
Hello again and welcome back to part 2 of On the Line. I'm Christine Williams. We're now talking about caring for your pet. Joining us is Dr. Barrie Burtis. He is a vet with the Bay Cities Animal Hospital, and he's brought along a little friend with him called Jersey. What a sweet little pup.
Sweet little puppy, isn't she, Christine? It's Jersey is a little Chihuahua puppy, and she's just 11 weeks old now, so she's just a baby. But as you can see, very well behaved, even though she's very young. She's a lovely little puppy.
Oh, now taking care of your pet has always been, of course, the paramount concern coming from you, and it should be the biggest concern even from pet owners.
Yeah, certainly it's the big part of my job every day, and you know, keeping up to date with the new diseases and new treatments and new disorders and new problems that that we need to be aware of to keep our pets healthy and well the way we want them to be. Very conscious of wanting them to enjoy the same quality of life that the rest of the family has, and there are so many things that we can do to achieve that now.
Now, Dr. Burtis, later on in this program, I want to talk to you about those horrible headlines we've been seeing about the contaminated pet food. That's something that we definitely need to address today. But I want to talk to you a little bit about Jersey when it comes to caring for pups. I mean, different ages require different care.
Yes. Well, Jersey, at 11 weeks of age, is about the age that most people will bring a new pet into their house. If it's a new kitten or a new puppy, usually sometime between 6 and 9 weeks is the time that it will arrive in your new home. It turns out that's a very good time for the puppy to arrive because it's at a very important stage in its social development at about that time. It has its primary socialization period through until it's about 16 to 18 weeks of age. So it's a very important time for you to be getting your new puppy and begin the socializing, learning the important rules that the puppy needs to learn to be a good pet citizen.
And that learning curve can be very difficult for pet owners, I would imagine. You think of it from the point of view of infants, where mom and dad could panic over every little thing because they're not sure if this is normal, this isn't. What are some of the chief complaints that you hear from new pet owners?
Well, I think that, you know, every puppy is different. Every puppy, every kitten is an individual, and they are somewhere on the scale probably of being very submissive, willing to give in to anything, to at the other end of the scale being very dominant, very stubborn and very set in their ways. Now, ideally, to be a good pet, we don't want a pet at either end of those extremes. We want them a healthy mix in between. We don't want them so terrified or so frightened of every new situation and new circumstances they encounter that they're so frightened that they may be fearful. On the other hand, we don't want them too dominant. We don't want them too in charge. They can't be the leader of the pack. So we want to achieve a puppy in the between, and it's important to watch for the signals or signs that might indicate that they're going to show behavior that will be a problem later in life. You know, problem behavior is probably one of the most common reasons that pets have to be given up.
Wow.
And so it's really important, along with all the other physical things that you need to take care of. You need to, you know, make sure their diet is correct and you're getting vaccinations and health examinations and checkups and all those health physical things that you have to do. You also have to be really conscious of getting them socialized, developing the proper behavior that you want them to demonstrate.
Now, as a professional, what are some of the early warning signs that an owner can notice?
In general, you want a puppy who is quite comfortable in new situations with new people. You want them not to be aggressive if you try to do something to them, if you pick them up, if they're chewing on a piece of food or some bone. You want them willing to give it up to you. You don't want to have them react aggressively to that, showing that, no, I need to be in charge, not you. And so you need to be able to do things with them. You need to be able to open their mouth. You need to be able to lift them up. You need to be able to perhaps turn them over on their back. You need to be able to do things to them. And you can do that if you go about it slowly and gently and, you know, properly with the right degree of certitude on your part. Then they'll learn to accept that. And so it's watching for little signals that they're not willing to let you do things like that, or if they're very terrified by someone new coming in. Well, you need to help them overcome that shyness that might later on be a bigger problem.
Yes. Now, Dr. Burtis, we're going to have to go for a break, but you heard the words, slowly, gently, and properly. Now, I'm going to be questioning Dr. Burtis on some of the techniques you need to know, and you'll also be meeting another little pet after the break. Stay tuned. again and welcome back to our conversation. We're talking about caring for your pet. Joining us is Dr. Barrie. He is with the Bay Cities Animal Hospital in Burlington. And also joining us now is Sasha. Same breed,
Same
type.
breed, different color.
Yes.
This is Sasha, and Sasha is just 3 days younger than Jersey. So they're very similar to one another. And yet, you know, as we were talking about before, everyone's an individual. And Sasha here is quite a little different personality and temperament than her sister Sasha. She tends to be a little bit more withdrawn. She lets Jersey go out and do the exploring, and Sasha kind of holds back. And she's, the owner tells me that she's a little bit more reluctant to have certain things
It's
done to her. She's a
interesting
little bit more
because the owner,
independent.
her name is Jean, and she was telling us during the break, well, if you're going to be talking about obedience and training, the other one, the other little
Yes,
one is a better example, Jersey.
Sasha's going to be the one that takes just a little bit more work and effort that way, and yet she's also very good.
And she's now on her best behavior.
Yeah, she is. She's you know, quite willing to let me stroke her behind the back of her head like this, and just because Jean's been working with this and doing, as we said earlier, you know, with little puppies, if there's something that they don't like you to do, then you should be doing it frequently until they, you know, could care less whether you're doing it or not. And that just helps them learn that it's not, I'm not hurting you, I'm not breaking your spirit or dominating you, or certainly never being, you know, cruel or punishing behavior that you don't like. You're just working with it, and slowly and steadily you should make the progress that you want.
Now, that was one very major technique you gave when it comes to training your pets. Do you have any others, Dr.
Well,
Burtis?
I think that the things that puppies in general tend to be most reluctant to let you do things with is usually around their face. They tend to be wanting naturally to be a little bit in control of things that are happening around their face. So it's a good plan just to, you know, pat them gently there. Don't get them too excited or worked up, but just get them willing to let you lift their lip and look at their teeth. Perhaps just, you know, move their ear and look at their ear, and just let them know that you're not hurting at doing those things.
Sasha is well trained.
Yeah, she, you know, is being very good at doing that now. So you do things like that, perhaps around their feet, handling their feet, touching their toes, doing things of that kind. The other thing that I always recommend, and it really doesn't matter whether it's a little Chihuahua, a little small dog like they are, or a St. Bernard, a giant breed, any breed of dog, it's so important to take them to puppy classes, and you know, a spot where they're going to be in a class with other puppies, with other people, where they're learning some of the social skills at a place like that. It's wonderful for the owners too, because there's much learning, you know. Puppies have lots to learn, but so do their owners. And so to know how to react to inappropriate behavior, to know how to do some of the usual grooming and care procedures that all dog owners will need to do, puppy classes are wonderful things for all puppies to attend.
Now, this is another question, not quite related. Now, I know that Chihuahuas don't grow very big, so that's one of the pluses for people who like tiny little pets.
Yes.
And I know that there's some dogs that they never grow. They're crossbreeds beyond this little tiny size. But I had a question posed to me today by Elaine. I promised to say what your name was on air. And she said, well, what about cats? Do they not breed cats as tiny as those little dogs? And if not, why?
Yeah. Well, cats over the years, and they've been, you know, cats have been with people or living with people, domesticated if you like, almost as long as dogs. Dogs are the longest animal species that have ever lived in close proximity with humans, for probably 12 to 15,000 years. Cats are probably around 10,000 years. But there has been much less manipulation, or there has been much less done with cat breeds than with dog breeds. The cat breeds that we see today are much, much closer to their natural ancestors all those thousands of years ago than many breeds of dogs. Most dog breeds, we have modified them significantly in their size, in their traits, and their characteristics. Now, it's not known for sure why this is, but one suggestion is that we have we have created different size and different temperament in dogs to help humans with some of the things that they want to do. Herd animals or be guard dogs or different things of that kind. For cats, cats were used principally for pest control and things of that kind, which didn't depend on their size.
So there never was a historic incentive.
There wasn't really the need to modify them as much with, you know, if we say not natural breeding, more influence from human aspect. So that's one suggestion why we don't have those same things.
Dr. Burtis, one of these days I'm going to have to bring you back here just to talk about the history of pets. It's fascinating, some of the information you share with us. And in case you didn't know, Dr. Burtis, you were telling me that the Chihuahua was seen or believed to be the sacred dog of the Aztecs.
Yes, they're named, of course, Chihuahua after the city and the state in Mexico. That's where they take their name from. But Chihuahuas are thought to have evolved and been developed in South America, and they are reputed to have been the sacred dog of the Aztec in that continent. So they've got quite a long, rich history, and still a very popular breed of dogs today.
Well, it was so great having on our little pets, and we're going to go for a break now. And when we come back, we're going to be addressing some of those tragic headlines we've been seeing about contaminated pet food. Stay tuned. Hello again, and welcome back to our talk about pet care. Dr. Barrie Burtis is with us, and Sasha decided to stay on. Oh, she's more than welcome to. Now, unfortunately, we talked about a tragic headline that we'd been seeing over and over again about pets falling victim to contaminated foods.
Yeah.
I'd like you to address this, Dr.
A
Burtis.
really sad story, and of course still an ongoing story. We certainly don't know fully in Canada how many Canadian pets have truly been affected by the problem. The problem, of course, relates to the somehow probably the introduction of a rat poison called aminopterin into some soft, canned or moist dog foods and cat foods that are sold in North America. And it's still being checked to be sure that that's the only agent that has caused the problem. But of course, tragically, it somehow got in some of these foods, and pets who have eaten the food potentially have very serious kidney damage result. It causes acute kidney failure. And so obviously a very tragic story, and one that, you know, is so sad because people feel that they're feeding their pet proper foods and doing the best they can for them, to find out something like that has happened.
Any comforting words,
terrifying.
Dr. Burtis?
Well,
Anything to watch out for?
I think
something
that,
you
know,
can...
certainly we would always recommend that if you have had your pet on one of the recalled foods, it would be certainly important to check with your veterinarian, because sometimes some of these poisons will not cause initially or early in the course clinical signs or things that the owner might recognize as a problem. So if you know that your pet has been eating one of those recalled brands, I would suggest you check with your veterinarian, and it might be that there would be some tests or some blood tests to be sure that your pet hasn't been threatened. The signs of acute kidney failure would be a pet who is becoming lethargic, a pet who is not eating, has lost its appetite, would probably be showing some vomiting, and just general, you know, lassitude, just inappetence, lethargy, and probably vomiting. Those are usually the first signs that we would see with kidney failure. And certainly, if any of those signs were recognized, obviously very quickly check with the veterinarian.
Is it more of a problem in the States than in Canada, or would you say pretty much
equal?
It tends
that, well, it to this point appears to be more a problem in the U.S. It probably was plants there that are generally more affected. But we are, you know, at this point in time, a laboratory in Guelph is checking and tracking and, you know,
and we don't need to be paranoid?
Well, no, I think that, you know,
it's not widespread enough?
No, I think certainly the brands that have been a threat have been recalled, and certainly checking to make sure that your pet is not eating one of those brands, and making sure that there's not any danger that way for them is the thing to do at this point.
Wow, well, Dr. Burtis, we're out of time for today, and you're going to have to bring us more pets in the future.
Happy to do that. It's been good to be here.
Thank you so much for joining me. See you again on our next program. I'm Christine Williams, and from all of us, thank you for watching.